Hello YouTube, and welcome to Sega SG Awesome. It's a chronological look at the Sega SG-1000. In this episode, we'll take a look at the 9th game, Champion Tennis. Champion Tennis is the second game in Sega's Champion Sports series. It's also the second in what I consider the early 80s Japanese console sports trilogy. Both the SG-1000 and the Famicom both started with tennis, golf, and baseball. Sega will complete this trilogy with their baseball game, which is game number 11. In comparing the SG-1000 and Famicom versions, the Famicom versions were always a lot better. Now, most of the Sega's versions predate them, with this trilogy coming out all in 1983. A lot of these games appear in 1984 for the Famicom. But Tennis, both of these games appear in 1983, and Sega's version is far worse than the Famicom version. Nintendo's version of Tennis feels like a typical, although early, tennis game of the mid-80s to late 90s. It plays pretty much like Super Tennis would on the Super Nintendo, so on and so forth. But Sega's Champion Tennis feels much more like a game made during the late 70s to early 80s. Champion Tennis really feels more like a souped-up version of Pong rather than a basic tennis game. This is mostly due to not actually having to hit a button to return the ball. In fact, the only time you actually have to hit a button is to serve and to start the game. After that, you just move your avatar to intercept the ball, so it's basically just a person-shaped paddle of Pong. In this way, Champion Tennis is really more of a clone of Activision's Tennis, more than a contemporary of Famicom's Tennis. And unfortunately, this Pong mechanic conflicts with several parts of making a tennis simulation that they did put into the game. See, Sega added things like ball height and a net, and whenever you don't really get control over the type of hit that you get or anything like that, those tend to just get in the way and feel very random. Given these shortcomings, though, the game still maintains a lot of the fun that Pong maintains. In that way, this game is pretty good with a second player. As a one-player game, there's not a whole lot to offer. The play can seem very random, and there's not a whole lot to look at. The game's fairly ugly. I think the look of the game can really be summed up by the color choice of the tennis court. I'm not really sure what's going on there. So, would I recommend Champion Tennis? Surprisingly, I probably would. You know, the SG-1000 doesn't have a lot of games that I would just wholeheartedly, hands down, recommend to people. It's just not one of those systems. In fact, most consoles, years in the line, don't have very many games like that. And the SG-1000 just really doesn't seem to have a Phantasy Star like the Master System does, where you can just recommend it to people decades later. You buy an SG-1000 because either you're a big Sega collector and you just want to have it as a mantelpiece, or you like these old games. The SG-1000 was very much a cousin to the ColecoVision. And Champion Tennis really feels like that type of game. This is, more than any game I've played so far in the SG-1000, the most Atari-like. And that's not really a bad thing. If you're looking for a two-player Pong, this is a good game to get. If you're not, you can probably skip it. But if you're not looking for games like that, you can probably skip the SG-1000 anyways. If you're really into Atari games, seems like you would probably like a two-player Pong type of game. But much like Atari games, I wouldn't put a value of that type of game over a couple dollars. And that's where the problem is. Most of the time you're going to have to import it, and it's probably not worth the shipping charge.